We've been talking about conflict, and one of the things we need to discuss when it comes to conflict is how we're going to communicate in the midst of that. The reality is that we live in a digital generation that speaks a whole new language, and conflict speaks an entirely new language as well. I discovered this the difficult way in leadership when I would take my phone with me, and all of a sudden I would receive what I call this grenade of an email that would land wherever I was. I could be at a conference, I could be at home at dinner with my family, and an email would come into my inbox and it would explode. I mean, no one else would hear the explosion, but in my heart and in my own life, this email that I would read or this post that I would read would cause incredible pain and turmoil. Communication in the midst of conflict speaks an entirely new language. Someone disagrees with the decision we make at church, and so they post on Facebook and they get 100 likes from our people in our church family, and unfortunately it bleeds over into people in the community, and all of a sudden we're caught in the middle of this. The news media catches wind of a decision we've made or something that's happened, and it blows up and it becomes viral. Communication in the midst of conflict speaks an entirely new language in our generation. So we need to discuss today, we want to discuss what are some of the principles, lessons that we can learn as we try to communicate in the midst of conflict. We had another thing that was interesting that happened. We had a prayer chain at our church a number of years ago, and this was early on in my ministry. And we had an email prayer chain that was going on. We had a phone prayer chain. This was an email prayer chain. And in the midst of this, other people were added into the prayer chain who weren't people from our church family. And so as emails would go out, our office manager one time accidentally did not blind copy or blind send all of these email addresses with this message. So what that meant was that anyone who got this prayer message could now hit reply all and instantly have an audience of almost our entire church family, or at least the core families of our church family. So this outsider outside of our church disagreed with something that was said, and reply all kept being used by other people. It's almost like pirate ships shooting cannons over the waters of cyberspace at one another. And here I am as a leader going, I can't even contain this. I can't even control this. How do we respond in this moment? The reality is, again, we live in a generation where, man, we struggle with how to communicate in the midst of conflict. So with this, I want us to recognize there are some limitations to digital forms of communication. There's some benefits to it as well when it comes to mass communication. But sometimes we fail to step back and go, whoa, let's wait a minute and look at some of the downsides of communicating this way. Here's number one. Digital communication, especially in times of conflict, lacks vocal inflection. No matter how many smiley faces you add to the end of a sentence, sometimes we struggle to know, is that like a sarcastic smiley face or is that a happy smiley face? And so we recognize this when we sit face to face with someone. There is a sense where we can tell if they're being sarcastic or if they're being heartfelt, if there are tears in their eyes, or if their tone communicates that they are struggling. It communicates more than just what their words communicate. Number two is with that, the body language that goes along with this. We understand and we have this secondary language that's always happening in the background. And God created us this way. And we forfeit that in the midst of difficult times when we fail to meet face to face. It lacks facial expressions. It lacks the ability to respond in real time. So it lags when it comes to our response time. Face to face, you have the immediate opportunity to jump in and hopefully not interrupt. But in digital communication, I don't know how many times you've been there, but I've been there. It's where I send an email response saying, hey, we need to fix this. We need to talk about this. And I don't hear from the person. And I'm waiting and I'm waiting and I'm waiting. And I'm really wondering, what are they thinking in this process? And then I can almost think things that I shouldn't think. Maybe they're bitter. Maybe they don't want to talk to me. And the reality is they might just be busy. They might not have checked their email. But digital communication has that weakness. Here's the last limitation I want to give you for digital communication. It lacks instant accountability. There is an instant accountability that happens when I'm sitting with someone and my words cause their face to drop. My words obviously cause and inflict pain on them, and I have to see that face to face. We need these nonverbal cues to help translate for us what's going on relationally in the midst of our conversation, in the midst of our conflict. And so we need to covenant together. We need to commit together that we will gather together, that we will see each other face to face in the midst of these, that we will relate through our conflict. That being said, I also want to kind of give this disclaimer. Some of you say, well, it's helpful for me to write out my words. It's helpful for me to write out what I think. And I would agree with you. Write it out and bring it with you. Write it out and meet with the person and say, I've written out some things, but I need you to hear me, but I also need you to see me, and I need to see you in this. So a covenant that we as a leadership team made, and maybe this is something you consider making in your leadership team, and your church staff, or your eldership, or maybe just as a church, you make this as a covenant. We made this covenant. Here's number one. We're going to choose to gather in the midst of conflict. The verse, Jesus says, wherever two or more are gathered. And we say this, that Jesus is present in the midst of our conflict, just as he is in the midst of communion. We're going to choose to gather face to face, wherever two or more are gathered together. Number two, we're going to invite Jesus into our conflict. Number three, we're going to seek the kingdom. Number four, we're going to seek reconciliation. We're going to pursue these things, the kingdom and reconciliation. We're going to value one another. We're going to recognize that we have differences, and we're going to recognize those, but we're also going to speak truth in love. That's a covenant we had. And so part of our covenant was that if we had a problem that was going on in our church staff or in our church at large, is that we did everything we could to get into each other's homes or to get into each other's offices. In the church staff, we were not firing off emails over the walls into each other's offices. We would walk in and have a conversation. And I've seen the opposite of that. I've seen how dysfunctional a church staff can be when they don't meet together, when they don't talk together, when they don't eat together. It can crumble and fall apart because of conflict that we have. So we need to filter our communication. Here's some principles for that. Number one, you need to evaluate the motivation you have. Before you hit send, before you walk into someone's office upset, before you do, you need to check your heart. Are you concerned about reconciliation? Are you concerned about retribution? Do you need to be right? Or do you just need the kingdom to be healthy? Number two, evaluate the method of your communication. Are you going to gather? How is it best? If it does have to be digital, allow someone else to hear it, to read it, to give you insight of how it comes across in tone. What is the method of your communication? Number three, what's the scope? Let me pause here for just a minute. What's the scope of your communication? Another way of saying this, what is the blast radius that you're going to allow this communication to have? Is this something you're posting on social media so that everyone can see it? Or is this something that Jesus teaches us in principle? First, it needs to happen one-on-one, and then maybe two-on-one or a group-on-one. And this communication that needs to be in this, and Jesus would say principle-wise, this communication of conflict needs to be in the smallest group possible, and then expanding out as is necessary, but only what is healthy for reconciliation, only what is healthy for bringing a person back to being in Christ. So what is the scope of your communication? The reality is a number of people, they desire to have the largest blast radius as possible to get as much impact as they can. In that sense, they want to be heard. They don't necessarily want to help. Number five, we need to find common ground on which to stand. We need to start from a place of commonality. So if I'm meeting with a couple and we're disagreeing about worship styles, because that's like the thing we disagree about most, it seems like, but we're disagreeing on that, we need to come at least start with a place where we do agree. We agree with who God is. We agree with the value of worship and the purpose of worship, that worship is about God and not about us, that it is about His desire and His heart, not about our desires and our preferences. So we need to start on common ground, and then we can have a conversation. Or maybe it's about a child in the youth group. You know that we both care about, I know that you care about your child, and I care about them as well. So let's talk about this decision in our program. So we need to start on common ground. Here's the next thing. We need to plan out our communication points. With something, and the deeper and the darker the conflict is, the more intentional we need to be about spelling out how we will talk about this issue. Sometimes it can even be a legal matter when it comes to spelling out exactly what we will say, when we will say it, and in what tone and in what environment we will say this. it can be vitally important in the midst of conflict to be diligent in planning out. Same thing is true when it comes to having a team seem unified, or not even appear unified, actually be unified. So sometimes we had script out as a church staff or as a church eldership, how will we talk about this? What will be the script, if you will, that we will say? Because we wanted to not only be unified, but communicate in a unified manner. So sometimes we need to script out some of those communication points. Here's a valuable thing that we learned. Number 7, we needed to test flight our communication. Here's what I mean by that. We took some of the decisions that we knew were in the midst of conflict or that would cause conflict. We took them into environments such as a ministry team leaders meeting or certain small groups or entrusted advisors who are part of our church family or maybe outside our church family. And we would fly our communication. We would communicate the same points. Here's how we're going to communicate it. Here's some of the same artifacts we're going to present. And we would get reactions. How did that come across? What questions do you have? What criticisms do you have? Do you totally disagree? And even when we got the totally disagree comments, it gave us the ability to go back and rewrite and retest how we were going to communicate this to the larger audience, to the congregation at large. And so there was wisdom gained in that. And we did this with major decisions that we knew would come with conflict. We would test fly them in smaller groups, our staff, leadership teams, small groups, and then we would finally, at large, fly them and allow them to be in the open air. So that's number 7. Here's number 8. We needed to create, for conflict as well as anything else, feedback channels so that people knew how to communicate with us in a healthy way. We needed to create feedback channels. Number 9, we needed to give grace to those who disagreed. Sometimes we just needed to say, we disagree, and yet we'll worship together. And we needed to be okay with that. We needed to not let the conflict over an issue get in the way of us being a family. Number 10, we needed to allow room for people to heal. Sometimes people would say, hey, I'm leaving the church. We're out of here. And then over the course of time, they'd end up back in our church family. Sometimes they just needed time to heal. And we needed to give people grace in the same way that we needed them to give us grace in response. One of my prayers in seasons like that was God speak in situations where I don't have the ability to speak. God heal hearts that I don't have the ability to heal. Mend relationships that I don't have the ability to mend. But God, just help me in this process to be a servant of reconciliation. Number 11 is don't throw people under the bus. Don't take this conflict and just use it as an excuse to take someone else and make them the cause of the conflict, or to really make the conflict a non-issue, but to make it all about the person. Don't throw people under the bus. Let conflict be conflict. Let people be valuable in Christ. Number 12 is this. When you're in the midst of conflict, recast a compelling vision. Recast a vision of how you can move forward through the conflict and where it is you're going, even if it looks like light at the end of the tunnel. Recast a vision and say, I know that God can use us through this. Like Moses bringing the people out of Egypt and through the wilderness. God can take us to a place that is a place where He wants us. And He can teach us in the process. And He can grow us in the process. And as we're struggling to figure out how all of this is going to play out, God can take this and He can use it to cause in us a crucified life, a Christ-like life. Sometimes conflict isn't near as bad as what we think it is. Sometimes God uses that to refine us and to reform us to look more like Jesus. I don't know if you find yourself in the midst of conflict today. Maybe that prayer that Jesus taught us to pray, Our Father who art in heaven, is a valuable thing to remember. That God's in heaven and He is there with us in the midst of our earthly daily bread. And He will lead us through that.